So to allow the people who are looking or reading or whatever they're doing to kind of work off of that. And the skill that I see, and I don't want to sound like I'm patronizing, but I see going into this is pretty extraordinary. But forget about the face. Just, what is this kind of do in the abstract? I'll use that and kind of go with that.
Yeah, I don't know how to respond. I mean, it's interesting, what you're saying. Are you asking for more ambiguity in the work?
Yeah. And that's probably not the right word. It just, I'm asking for more about you as an artist, where we're not worried about whether it's somebody else's face or somebody else's body. It's basically it's your imagination. And it's up to us to be able to read it or not, and go from there.
Roberta, why don't you answer for me, please? Okay.
The abstraction and figuration is what is the beauty of this. The representation and the cognition of having something abstract and then being able to see that it isn't abstract. You don't have to know it. And a lot of people would just see it as abstraction. Those that have the knowledge can't just see it as both.
But as you were saying, Ralph, when people descend, they finally see the face and there's this big, flash of recognition. And,
Yeah, that's my goal. It's interesting. It's hard to put into words. This may be a language problem more than an art problem, but it's public art. When I do public art, I feel it's almost halfway to architecture and that it has an aura of utility about it in the best way. I get mad at architects when they give up utilitarian, things. And I'm creating for a client. I'm creating for an audience. And my first audience is me. Okay, if I don't satisfy me and my own interests, then I'm not going to make it. But I think the challenge is I've got a ton of ideas, and which ones are going to translate into public art? And that's what I've chosen to be my specialty. But it's interesting. I like the payoff. And in terms of ambiguity, maybe it's the wrong word. We could use a different word, but like most of us who've sat through grad school, people were defending their work and said, "I'm really trying to embrace the ambiguity." And my thought bubble was, "Don't worry." It's like, try to be clear. I guarantee it will still be ambiguous. And I think part of my career has been a reaction to that, where, if one enters, particularly in public art, with a sense of generosity, that's just like an imperative for me, an aesthetic generosity. Loesch.
Please. What's striking about this session compared to most of the others we had is how similar you are. I mean, you overlap a great deal more than most of the peers that talked here. I'd like to hear from you both. How do you think you're different?
Well, I'm a historian of science, so I'm not just making something that is something that's aesthetically pleasing is not an endpoint in my work, where it could be in my art, something that satisfies me. I need to reveal a story or gain some other understanding of the past and the place of science in people's lives. So that content is also part of my work. I'm not saying that content isn't part of Ralph's, but that is an essential part of my scholarship as well as my communication art. It is, to get people to look at the world differently and learn about the past, something they didn't know, to take it into the present. Now there is a lot of overlaps. I'm saying these words. I mean, it sounds like art, right? But but there is this grounding that is in the real objects that are from history and in the past. So my starting point is this pre-existent material stuff that I'm trying to understand and share something I learn about it with others. So it can't be totally abstract.
I think the curatorial prowess you bring to your life is, a central focus that maybe I don't have, but I do find myself edging over into instrumentation. When I saw the images, you're thinking, like I'm designing with great help of my studio crew of sculptures that I hope are primarily aesthetically fascinating and challenging, but also they're becoming almost instruments, for perception. Many of you may know Duke Ryder, and he wrote a book 20 years ago that just still inspires me, and his firm at the time was called Urban Instruments, but I'm making outdoor pieces that actually you can enter, and they help focus. In my fondest hopes, they connect the terrestrial and the celestial and try to put us where we are on Earth and get off my hamster wheel, just experience my life right there then.
How about here?
Looking at the Harvard collections unfold over several decades, one is struck, first of all, by the depth of them. A very small fractions were exhibited at one time. And because of their historical depth, they at least hold a mild epiphany, which is they embody and they reify a whole aesthetic that flowered in the 19th century. Minimalism of which prefigured modern art in many ways. As the curator, can you enlighten us as to what you think the most striking aspect, most striking instruments that you curate that present art?
The most striking instruments that I curate from which period?
The early 18th, 19th century.
Okay, because I curate instruments that go back to the Middle Ages, but
the earliest precision instrumentation.
okay. Well, a lot of we have instruments that have multiple functions. So some are measuring instruments, but others are for experiment and observation. And so precision isn't necessarily a category that I would put them all into. But some of our very special precision instruments. One is a mathematical calculating instrument invented by Galileo in 1597 and made by Galileo's own instrument maker and given to the Duke of Mantua in 1604. This is a very rare piece and could be used to extract cube roots and figure out how to attack your enemy with the cannonball at the right angle and so on. We have things, the nature of precision is changing over the periods of the collection. And so we have things that are hand divided without any machinery to do it or precision screws, and then other things later that are made with other precision machine tooling to make them. And I have some various favorites of things, but they range in, we have a lot of instruments that were purchased with the help of Benjamin Franklin, who was deputized to go spend Harvard's money in the 1760s in London after a fire burnt down most of Harvard's, in which Harvard lost its library and scientific instruments and museum collections. We have instruments that were in the philosophy department, which is where experimental psychology got its start. And that were also used by Hugo Munsterberg, who developed, was very much involved in early cinematography, but it's coming out of the philosophy department. And so, there's so many ways.
Philosophy was a big thing.
There's so many ways to look through these collections. And we have, of course, instruments that were used to, discover nuclear magnetic resonance, the piece of the building in which it was discovered. So we have landmark things, but we also have the tools of very common basic scientific work or the people's lives and the ways they used mathematics or scientific things in their daily goings about. So it's a kind of hard question to answer. It's not just, it would really need, I would want to have more context to answer it.
So maybe a couple more.
How about Steffi over here?
Sure. You mentioned in your very first piece, you said, oh, and this one I didn't use a computer.
Yeah.
And I know I've gotten lazier with computer use and ending up depending on a computer for certain things, or gotten frustrated with my own children and said, you should be able to do that. You don't need a computer. But the time to take all those tiny pieces, which were so cool, and turn them that way, I can't even imagine where you started. So maybe you could just tell us the process.
Well, that same photograph of Werner Heisenberg, she's asking how that piece was made. And I wanted both my parents had just died, and it was really a perfect time to just be meditative. And so I got a very large photograph of Werner Heisenberg, and I hung it on the wall behind them. And I just had a grid, and I started hanging stuff. And it was very lapidary. It was kind of like, oh, I've got this great, try to get it. And then, wash, rinse, repeat, over 3 months, and then you have that. But but I mean, I think sculptors, getting back to computers and non-computers and their potential and dangers, it's great. I'm looking at Michael Bourne's here, and he's a computer jockey. He's helped us out a lot, and Dan Shaw is back there. And sculptors have always used the best measuring devices at their disposal. I mean, the Great Sphinx wasn't kind of it needs more nose. It was somebody measured a model and they built the thing. It was there, and so you have to just be. Paradoxically, in my studio, we kind of skipped the 20th century, which is much of my favorite art, but we use computers. We start out looking like 19th century and then make something for the 21st century, transforming it often with computers.
Can you each talk about a satisfying experience you've had collaborating with a scientist, living in somewhat ambiguous
Well, as a historian of science at a place like Harvard, I am in touch with a lot of scientists, of course, many of whom, we have 20,000 objects in our collection, and a fair number of them have come out of various scientists' labs. So at some point, it's kind of like a clubhouse where elder scientists come back to visit their equipment. and I always get great stories from it. Because one of the ways that I collect the apparatus is I collect it when it is more recent. I collect it with the materials attached to it that the scientist had. So if they had their child's little, cardboard candy cane and mittens that they made in kindergarten hanging on the respirometer, when I go to collect it, I'll ask, can I take it with that? Or love letters stuck on an instrument. And sometimes they say no, they'll keep the love letters. I just take a photo of it and then I take the object. But I try to contextualize it. And so there are many cases where I have had wonderful experiences in learning about the use of instruments and their role in particular laboratory work in this kind of informal way. And being able to do a bit of an oral history. And sometimes it recently I spoke to Nicholas Bloombergen, who is a physicist, Nobel Prize winner for work on nonlinear optics, and we had an early laser that had been attributed to his lab, and I showed it to him, and he's like, I don't recognize that thing, you know? So I'm like, oh, okay, but what about this over here? And he said, oh, yes, that was the first stuff we used for NMR. And here is my lab was in this basement, and I made a hole in the wall so I could talk to the other grad student who was doing the other half of the experiment on the other half of the wall. And we had to keep this coolant in, it was supercooled electromagnet, and he had to suck up, to get it started, he had to suck up this frozen, I forget what it was now, alcohol or something. You know, it was like, you know, many degrees below zero, but he had to be, there was no OSHA rule. So he was sucking it in with his mouth to get it into the system to start the electromagnet. Anyway, so you get these stories, you know, interspersed with how he fled, you know, Europe after World War II, and, you know, his ships were sinking, and he happened to be on one that didn't sink, and being bombed, you know, and so those are so enriching for me, because they really bring the objects to life. And the best story I have on this, if I could just say one more thing, is, so I curated an exhibition for the American Physical Society for their 100th anniversary. And it talked about different, you know, periods and episodes in the life of the society, of the APS. And I was talking about the censorship, self-censorship during World War II because of nuclear secrets, and the physics community would have liked to share ideas across with other physicists in other nations, but because of the Manhattan Project and other classified projects, the Physical Review wasn't published for a few years, and things were censored and held back. And I had a letter of one scientist, and I'd found it in the Library of Congress, and it was marked classified. And it was, he had sent a paper to Physical Review, and the editors had said, well, they couldn't publish it because of this self-censorship during the war. So it was classified, even his letter, marked top secret, and then it was classified so much that they never sent the response back to him. And I found it in the Library of Congress, and I used a reproduction of it in the exhibit. And he was one of the visitors to the show, and he came up and he said, where did you get this letter? So I'm introducing him, and I said, well, I explained the story, and he said, well, I never received it. And it was the first he got to read the answer why his paper wasn't published.
In your show?
In my show.
That's wild.
And so the show traveled around, and at one point it was in New York City, and I told this story, and he was in the audience again, and he came up, and so we had this dialogue in front of about living history, and you know, so that was a very meaningful moment. This was Goldhaber. This was the atomic scientist, Maurice Goldhaber, who was recently passed on, but it was a great experience for me, you know, coming at this material from different sides of history.
And he wasn't concerned that you were stalking him or anything?
No.
Okay, that's...
No, I arranged to get him a copy of the letter because he didn't have it, you know, so I could.
I would answer your question, except we're 50% beyond our time,
Yeah,
so I think that's the official.
We can continue more informally, and I just want to thank everyone for coming. It was really fabulous.
Thanks a lot.